Welcome to the Psychology World podcast. I'm Connor Whiteley, bringing you psychology news, articles, and other interesting psychology-related articles. Where I can find the podcast notes and more interesting psychology-related things, and you can get your free 8 psychology book box set at connorwhiteley.net. Now let's get on to the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 56 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on: should psychologists be able to prescribe medication to patients? So this, I think, is really interesting, and I absolutely loved researching this topic because if you remember a few episodes ago, I said I was going to attend British Psychological Society talk on it. Well, that talk didn't really happen, and so I decided to do an entire episode on it based on my own research. That's the topic of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section. So we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and there's actually some quite interesting articles. So, for example, and I did want to say, if you hear any noises like thumps and bumps, it's because downstairs we're moving around to the living room. Well, my mum and dad are. So going back to the psychology news section. So here's how the experience of regret develops through childhood. Etin Parth, I think that's how you say the name, famously regretted nothing. But regret is an important emotion because it can lead us to avoid repeating mistakes or to heal damaged relationships. It's also an emotion that many of us feel on a regular basis. Open quote. Regret is ambiguous and powerful, close quote, writes Therese McCordman at Queen's University Belfast and colleagues in a new paper published in Current Directions in Psychological Science, open quote. It is one of the most frequently mentioned emotions in conversation and affects a huge variety of everyday choices, close quote. Though there has been plenty of work on regret in adults, much less is known about how it develops in children. In this new review, McCoyam and her colleagues, what we do know about its development, and outlines the major gaps still left to fill in. There are implications not just for basic understanding of regret, but also for informing educators in nurseries and schools. After all, even young children are expected to feel bad about harming others, but depending on their age, there are limits to say just what they feel in such a scenario. So this, I think, is really interesting, because regret, as they said, is a really important emotion because it can lead us to go out and repair relationships, and it can also help us to avoid making mistakes. I think it's really important to reflect that, well, we don't necessarily know enough about regret in children, and as we know from other studies, everything in the formative years is still really important. So I think it's a shame that we've got this massive gap on regret, because we don't know how regret develops, and then we also don't know how it influences children at later stages in their lives. So I think it's important that we focus on this in the future, perhaps. Of course, that's if you're into developmental psychology, which after this week I'm not. So another one is people who want to be more empathetic may also develop liberal moral values. So no matter how happy you are in yourself, there's probably something about your personality you'd like to change. Maybe you feel you're too uptight or want to be more outgoing, or perhaps you'd like to be less moody or more tolerant of other people's shortcomings. It's likely that a change in personality will have some kind of social consequence, whether that's in your relationship with your spouse or your ability to get on with your colleagues, but it might also affect which moral values you hold important. A new paper finds that a growth in one area, empathy, was associated with a shift in morals foundation for a more classically liberal style of acting. Yes, this I don't really think there's too much to say on, but I think it's really interesting and also makes a sense, because if you're conservative, but then you might not be as empathetic as someone who's having a more liberal, more problem. So, for example, if someone's got quite a low-paid job and they're struggling to pay bills, but then as a strict conservative, then you might not see it as a problem as much as a strict conservative, but that's their own fault. And this idea of the estate helping the people is relatively new, to be honest, because it only really came into effect 1850, I think, in the UK. I'm pretty sure that's about right, but even then it was it was pretty conservative. It was just like, we'll give you like a tiny bit of money to like help you out. Yes, and then like before that you like had 1,000 years of like no benefits or anything quite like that. Yes, like it makes sense if you want to empathise with people, but then you might want to be a bit more liberal in your attitudes. Yes, and then there's just two more that I want to do. So gruesome descriptions can make crime seem worse, but judges and lawyers are immune to this bias. We often like to think of ourselves as impartial decision makers, but of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Our day-to-day thoughts and behaviours are biased in all kinds of ways, but it's the same true for people in the legal profession, which prides itself on its supposed objectivity and fairness. According to a new study in humanities and social science communications, God, that's a big title, judges and lawyers may be immune to at least some of the biases that affect the rest of us. In particular, their judgments may seem less proven to bias in effect by emotive language. However, I think that this could be mainly down to like awareness, like simply because they know the tactic that the lawyer is like trying like to use, meaning they might be able to like, resist it more consciously. And also, I think it might also tap into desensitization, because if you constantly have like to gruesome like restrictions, but then over time things are as shocking. And that one I will actually save for that news description for the second edition of Forensic Psychology. Actually, so with the editor's pick, what is it like to experience mental health problems? And on a side note, it says here that it's actually Mental Health Day. Yes, it's World Mental Health Day today on Saturday, but I thought it was yesterday. At least that's what all the news outlets said. But I did just want to say that any of you can always contact me, email me, yes, at connorwiley@connorwiley.net if you ever feel like alone or anything. Even if you just simply want to say hello, then that's fine. So we're moving on to the article. We've rounded up some of the research we've covered over the years to explore what it's like to live with mental health problems. And even that word problems is a bit, really? It is like 2020. Can't you just say conditions or difficulties? Something that's a bit kinder. So from obsessive compulsive disorder to hearing voices, psychologists call these kind of studies qualitative research, where the aim is not to put a score against a particular symptom, but to discover the first-hand perspective and experience of people who take part, based on their own words. Such studies are often distressing to read, but their insights make a vital contribution to our understanding of the human condition. Yes, and then I just want to point out this one thing from the article. So depression feels like a kind of emptiness. A recurring theme from interviews with 7 people diagnosed with depression was the sense of depletion and emptiness, both bodily and in thinking about the past and future. Open quote, "It's like something's wrong in a side of me and so swept my happiness away," close quote, said one participant. Open quotes, "I feel like sometimes my life is on hold," close quote, said another. Isolation was another key theme, as described by this man's description. Open quote, "You get into a state, I think, mentally where you're just like on an island. You can see from this island another shore, and all these people are there, but there's no way for you to get across, or there is no way that you want to get across," like quote. Yes, that I think is just really, really like interesting, and this is another one that I'm actually going to say for probably Abnormal Psychology 3rd edition, which might be coming out next year. I don't know, to be honest. I've not really thought about which books I'm doing next year yet. Yeah, but I just think that's really interesting, and it definitely highlights the shame, about that, the unfortunate suffering that people go through. Yeah, but that I think is the good thing about psychology, is that we want to help others, we want to make their lives better, we want to make sure that they're not suffering, and we also want to make sure that they're not alone. So I hope you found this psychology news section interesting. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. Yes, this week was my first week back at university, and it's really nice to get back into proper psychology with proper lectures. And I think it's just great. To be honest, because I've had some really good lectures. So overall, I'm settling back in. Okay. Oh, but I do have to admit, child development is still not one of my favourite topics, because I had to go through the modern theories this week, and it was just, there's this theory, there's that theory, and one of them sounded so weird. It was I forget the name of the theory, but it was something along the lines of children are born with theories about the world. Okay, which I was a bit, really? And then what a child does is as they're learning, as they're exploring the world, they're constantly testing their theories, and they're basically everything was to do with their theories, which I understand the logic behind it. I'm just not sure if I like the theory itself. So I don't know. There's definitely some interesting theories about, which I thought was quite interesting. Or plus, I actually got introduced to my statistics. Like one of my statistics practicals, and it's a thematic analysis, which I definitely think I'll mention on the podcast in the future. Simply because I think it's really interesting, because it's how you do a proper thematic analysis, which is when you look for themes in dialogues and transcripts, which I think would be quite interesting. And there's different ways of coding it. So I don't know. I think that practical should be quite good. And then the only other really relevant thing that I wanted to say this week about about psychology is that because I'm doing a clinical psychology degree, this year I'm required to do a reflective diary. Whenever I do a topic, or whenever I do wider reading around psychology, I'm required to keep a reflective diary. Just so I can reflect on clinical psychology, and basically it's helping to train you for your masters, because in your clinical psychology masters you have something like clinical logs, I think I've read, which I was just I just quickly skimmed over. And because I'm pretty much required to do one once a week, what I'm most probably going to do is once a month I'm probably going to do a sort of reflection episode. Because the reason why I actually quite like that is that because it's actually quite nice to reflect on certain topics, but I can just talk about my own thoughts on a given topic, because these are podcast episodes, they are great, but for me they're all about giving you content, and they're giving you the best value for your time. But with these reflections, it'd be more about you get to hear about my own thoughts, the pros and cons of it, which you do sort of get, but I don't know, to be honest. And the things that I would probably have to end up doing my reflections on is that, well, you can't really talk about it in a podcast episode. But for example, after this, I'm actually going to be doing a reflection on this podcast episode, because it's on should a psychologist being able to prescribe medication, because that's to do with clinical psychology. So yes, I'll probably mention some of my thoughts and feelings on it at the end and throughout, but it'd be a more reflective piece. The next week's one, for example, might be on the Psychology of Religion book that I'm reading currently, because I don't know, I wouldn't really be able to talk about it on the podcast as such, because I don't know, to be honest, I don't know. But anyway, we'll have you should see that once a month in the future. Yes, and then I've also been doing a lot of fiction work. Oh, plus I almost forgot to say, I have recorded 2 online courses this week, so I'm saying it now, so I might try and get the courses done for next week's episode, just so I can announce them, because the 2 courses I've done is what causes depression, anxiety and OCD, and then I've also done another course on the treatment of mental conditions. But it focuses on depression, but it still focuses on it quite generally. So that I think will be really good, because you had the video of me teaching you and everything. So so that I'm actually really looking forward to. Because always you can always contact me to send me your thoughts and feelings on any podcast episodes, about anything I've said, or even just say hello at Sci-Fi Wiley on Twitter. And you can also email me, connorwiley@connorwiley.net, or you can leave a comment on the blog post at connorwiley.net/blogs. Or if you go to connorwiley.net/podcast, then you can scroll down, find the episode, click on it, and then that takes you straight to the blog post. And that really works if you're looking for older episodes that might have been but that might be quite far down. And today's episode has been sponsored by my Biological Psychology 2nd edition book. This book I really, really enjoy it, because it's all about biological psychology. It's how our biology affects us, and it's available on all major ebook retailers like Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Amazon. And then the paperbacks are available on Amazon, and that's also in paperback and large print. So here's the blurb. So, do you want to know how our biology can impact our behaviour? Have you ever wondered the importance of sleep and the meaning of dreams? Do you want to learn how and why we experience the senses we do? If the answer to any of these questions is yes and more, then this is the book for you, as you'll learn a lot of great information about biological psychology and how our biology impacts our behaviour, all explained in an easy to understand way. By the end of this book, you will know what biological psychology is, how evolution, hormones and neurotransmitters affect our behaviour, how our biology affects our behaviour, and much more. By today, start learning the fascinating topic of biological psychology. Yes, so I really enjoy this book, and hopefully you will too. So it's available on all major ebook retailers, and the paperbacks and large print are available on Amazon. And I wanted to say that on Friday the 16th of October 2020, it is the release day of my Formulation in a Psychotherapy book. Yes, if you want to do clinical psychology in the future, then I highly, highly, highly recommend that you would get that book, because it's really useful for clinical psychology masters. As an undergraduate, you don't tend to look at the topic of formulation, which is why I did it. I just really recommend it. Yes, and the price will increase to $4.99 on a Friday. So ideally, if you want to buy it, then try and get it before Friday the 16th of October 2020. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content of today's episode. So we're going to be looking at, should psychologists be allowed to prescribe medication as a treatment? So this, I think, is a really interesting topic, because as I said before, I was contending a British Psychological Society talk. For some time, that got changed to a Q&A, and when I tried to access the webinar, it didn't let me. So presumably people came 10 minutes early, and then they decided to fill it up. So I don't know. But to be honest, I'm actually quite glad that they did, and that I wasn't able to access it, because then it allowed me to do my own research and come up with today's episode. So hopefully you will enjoy it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some background information first, and then I'm going to do the for and against arguments. So firstly, psychologists being able to prescribe medication is not new, because psychologists are able to prescribe medication in 5 states in the USA. But psychologists are able to prescribe medication in Louisiana, New Mexico, Illinois, Ohio, and I've no idea how you say that last one. Oh, yes, Idaho. Sorry, it's just spelled a bit, I don't know, it's not spelled phonetically. Yeah, right, sorry about that, American. And I do just want to say that, yes, this article and that I use as my source for my information was pretty much all American, but this is the Psychology World podcast, and also we have a massive international listenership. I'm going to make this a bit more globally focused. So the idea of psychologists being able to prescribe medication isn't newer, because in New Mexico these are privileges that were granted in 2002, and then in Louisiana in 2004. So this is not some grand new idea. This is fairly old, at least 18 years old at the time of recording. And I also need to note that psychologists but they just can't automatically do it, because there are training requirements that must be met in each state. Okay, so moving on to what training is needed. So this really depends by state data, because in New Mexico, psychologists are required to complete 450 hours of didactic training, and that I wasn't able to find out what it is. And they also need to complete 400 hours of supervised practice in psychopharmacology. Yeah, there's some massive words in this one. Yeah, but this is basically just using drugs and medication to treat mental conditions. That's all that it is. And then in Louisiana, psychologists need to complete a postdoctoral master's degree in clinical psychopharmacology. So this is just an extra degree. Yeah, but then in Ohio State, people will still need to complete the extra degree, but they also need to have clinical experience in, this podcast episode is filled with massive words, so pathophysiology. Yes, and all with that, this is that this is the physiological processes that occur with a disease or an injury. Yeah, so this is more of the medical profession coming through. But they also need to have experience in a treatment. So in Ohio, you do sort of need the more doctor path, you could potentially say. And then the last one, which is in Illinois, the psychologists still need to have this specialised training in psychopharmacology, but they also need to complete a supervised clinical rotation that lasts for 14 months, and in this rotation, it covers a wide range of settings, for example, mental hospitals, mental health clinics, prisons and hospitals, and this is really common to how the UK clinical psychology doctorate works. Yes, because in 3 years, you need to do your 4 settings. You need to work with learning disabilities, working-age adults, retired people, and there's children and adolescents. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the arguments for psychologists being able to prescribe medication. So the first argument for this is it puts less strain on healthcare services. Because the original idea for this particular thought argument was in the US, because certain states face a shortage of psychiatrists, meaning that psychologists could pick up the extra workload. But this is why I try and make it a bit more global. So what I mean by making it a bit more global is that it could be good for psychologists to be able to prescribe medication, as it could allow doctors to be freed up, and the NHS in the UK could be put under less stress, and this could easily apply to all medical services in any part of the world, because instead of patients going to see doctors and GPs for their treatment, they can go and see a prescribing psychologist. This can make more doctor visits available, as some of the doctor's workload could be shifted, because instead of them dealing with mental health patients and clients, but the doctors will be able to focus more on their expertise, which is physical health. And the second thought argument, I'm not that sure on, because I don't know, to be honest, personally I don't like it as a thought argument. I class most of this as a negative, and as I said before, personally I'm still against this idea of psychologists being able to prescribe drugs. Medication, I need to be a bit more politically correct, medication. But after researching this episode, I am more understanding, and I do understand the benefits, because the thought argument that I just spoke about is actually, it does make a lot of sense. So moving on to the second one. So some people say that allowing psychologists to prescribe medication could increase access to psychological treatment. So this article does not go into any depth about this, so I'm going to try my best. So the only way how I could actually think that this could apply is the following situation. So this could be a great benefit to psychologists, because people with mental health difficulties that don't believe in psychomagic, yes, I've never heard that term used, but you get the idea, the people who don't believe in psychology or any psychotherapy, yes, probably avoid getting treatment currently, because of psychomagic is the only option to them, which, if anyone actually looked into it, isn't true. Anyway, as well as it could take them too long to see a psychiatrist, which these psychiatrists, because they can prescribe drugs, they can give them proper treatment. Yes, I was laughing when I was writing this. Right, okay, so anyway, yes, if psychologists are able to prescribe proper treatment, also known as medication, and then if mental health sufferers get quick access to this proper treatment by going to a psychologist, then these people will get the help that they need, and hopefully they will start to live a better, more fulfilled lives. And again, I do have problems with this idea, because again, I believe this is reinforcing the biomedical model, and as we all know, I prefer formulation, which is what next week's episode is going to be on, because I think it's such a vital topic to psychology and mental health treatment. And also, this completely ignores the biopsychosocial model, which I've spoken tons about on this podcast. But overall, you do get the idea about how psychologists being able to prescribe medication could potentially help. Right, okay, so now we're going to go on to the arguments against psychologists to prescribe medication. So firstly, a lot of professionals agree that simply doing another degree in psychopharmacology is not enough, especially considering doctors and other medically trained people go to medical school or university for at least 7 years, and that's the UK degree length, meaning that this does call into question, are psychologists trained enough to be able to deal with medical issues? Personally, I doubt it, and also I wanted to say that also the pharmacology, yes, the way how I've seen it works, this is my own experience, don't take me at my word about this, because again, I don't do biomedical science or that or the pharmacology, but the way how I've heard it works is that you do a 3-year bachelor's degree in biological science, and then you do your pharmacology on top of it. Okay, and this paragraph, I fully admit I did try to word this quite carefully, but hopefully you get the idea. So another thing though is that it's no different for a psychiatrist trying to deal with a mental health problem exclusively using psychology and not psychiatry, as psychiatrists are mainly trained in psychiatry and the biomedical model, because they're pretty much doctors. Yes, so because psychiatrists are pretty much trained as doctors first, and then they go into the mental health specialization. Whereas the psychologists have a better understanding and the mind and the human behavior. As this is what psychologists have been trained in exclusively. Again, both fields have their limitation, because psychiatrists have their limitation because they're doctors first. Psychology has its limitations because we don't know as much as we don't know much about biology and the biological processes and all the medical side of it as a psychiatrist, because we're not trained in it. So hopefully that makes sense. And this leads me into my second against argument, because what if a medical condition is overlooked and treated as a mental condition? Now, I actually need to emphasise this, because again, I was trying to word quite carefully. So I also need to emphasise that no professionals, whether it's doctors, psychologists, anthropologists, nurses, etc., get it right 100% of the time, and that is fine. We're all human, we all make mistakes. Because sometimes psychologists think a medical condition is a mental condition, and sometimes doctors think that a mental condition is actually a medical condition, even though it's not. And also, but the really complicated thing is that sometimes if you have a physical condition, like a medical condition, it can actually maintain or it can actually help the development of a mental condition. So it's all interconnected again. This is why the biopsychosocial model is really important to consider. So overall, it's not easy. However, I do just want to say that I think this against argument is rather unfair, but it does raise a good question, because with being able to prescribe medication, not being educated in medicine and medical conditions as much as doctors, how can psychologists ensure a medical condition isn't overlooked? And again, in all fairness, I do say that how can doctors and medical professionals ensure a mental condition isn't overlooked? Anyway, it's a really tough one. I just think that it's pretty, I don't know, this is not a clean-cut debate. And even after researching this, I like it that I'm more aware now of the pros and cons, and hopefully you are too. And hopefully you've really enjoyed today's episode. Granted, it's not easy because this is not an easy debate, because there are so many pros and there are so many negatives about it. So I would absolutely love to know your thoughts. So you can always tweet me on Twitter at SciFiWhitey. You can always leave a comment on the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/blog, or you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. So have a great day, everyone. Please check out my Formulation in Psychotherapy book before the price goes up on Friday the 16th of October 2020. Have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the show notes, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. And if you want a free 8-book psychology box set, then please go to connorwhiteley.net. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.